Okay, this is exploring part 2 on problem framing. We just talked about task and content analysis. Now we're going to take a step further and talk about how we frame a problem. And just so you know, the task and content analysis generally falls under a more rational school design approach, although it's also used in an action centric. The idea of reframing a problem is pretty action centric. So that's ahead. All right, so this guy, his name's Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. It's a fun name. He did a lot of really interesting studies. He said this: in most schools, all you learn is solving problems. Then you got out in the real world, you feel lost because no one's telling you what to solve. Sometimes the hardest part of designing something is to figure out what exactly the problem is that you're trying to solve. You might have a general idea, but narrowing that down to like a more fine-tuned problem that you can then solve can be kind of challenging. Here's a quote by Riddle and Weber: "The problem can't be defined until the solution has been found." Okay, just keep that in the back of your head for a minute. And I'm going to zoom back to the other week. I believe it was in week 3, where I told you the story about a architecture studio, and the students had been told we need to create a building for West Campus for innovation and education. And I told you the story about a student who reframed the problem. So already the solution had been to build a building. That meant the problem is we need a building, right? But when she did a needs analysis, she said, I don't think that the need is necessarily a building. Let's try reframing this. I think the need is having a lot of different spaces for people to connect around learning and innovation. And so she changed the problem, because the problem became we need a whole bunch of different spaces for people to connect. And that went with the solution of creating these spaces to connect. So do you see how the problem and solution start working together? They define each other. This was a famous architect, Charles Eames. He did some famous chairs, and I'm going to talk through this. It's a little hard to see on here. Let me see if I can draw this. He talked about this for framing. He said this section right here, that is the interest of the design office. Okay, so that's the interest of the design office you work for. This is the area that they like to work. And then this right here, this is the interest of the client. So do you see they overlap a little bit in the middle there? The client says, this is what I want. And then they say, this is like the general area for the whole context, like what the needs of society are. And then they find a little area that overlaps and says, okay, that's how we're going to reframe our problem. We're going to use some of what the design office or the designer is interested in. We're going to use some of what the people who are paying us are interested in, and what's good for society as a whole, and focus in on that area for our problem frame. Let me give you another example. This was my dissertation research I did with some teachers. And the teachers were I was working with them to help them address problems using design approaches. And they started out with this problem where they said, students have very bad behavior in our school. They don't respect adults at all. And so this is the problem that we want to fix, that they have bad behavior. Well, as we talked more, we reframed that. We said, I think they're just not engaged with learning. They come to school and they're not engaged. That's why they have bad behavior. Maybe instead of focusing on the behavior, we could focus on their engagement. And then COVID happened and everyone was physically separated. And it turned to, oh, you know what? I think everyone doesn't feel related to each other. We're not connecting to what a content area is or to each other. So instead of student behavior, why don't we focus on relatedness? How people and subject matters and such connect. And if we can build relatedness, that might actually affect student behavior. But we're now saying that the problem and solution are focusing on relatedness instead of on behavior. Another teacher from India told the story about a student who brought her in a newspaper advertisement about a car for sale and said, hey, I want this car. And this teacher was kind of like, oh, that's really cool. You should save your money to get it. And the student's like, I don't have enough money. But the student had a job. And so this teacher was a little confused about why the student couldn't save up her money to buy a car eventually. And she had found that a lot of the students had trouble doing that. And so she said, the problem is they have a lot of savings. They need more practice with savings. They don't have enough financial literacy. If the problem is they don't have the financial literacy that you need, the solution might be to instruct them on financial literacy. We can have a class on financial literacy. But the question is, would that really meet the needs here? Maybe we need to reframe the problem. And so another teacher brought up the poverty mindset, which is a way, I'm actually not a huge fan of poverty mindset because it puts people in a deficit view, but this is how the teachers talked about it, seeing that students might only focus on what they don't have instead of what they have. And when we look into the poverty mindset and what some people say helps people get out of that, it comes down to goal setting and gratitude. And this teacher said, okay, I'm going to focus on gratitude now. That's what I'm going to say is my problem. Instead of saying my students don't know how to save, I'm going to say, they need to learn to be grateful for what they have. And I hope that will help them develop habits that will lead to more successful financial practices. So problem and solution interacting. And it was a problem that they could act. They actually created this gratitude journal, like write about a person in your life that you're especially grateful for and why. And they were able to write about gratitude and do something with this idea. Whereas some of the other ideas they might not have been able to take action on. So sometimes the problem frame we choose is partly just because that's what we can do. But it also has to do with your interests, the community interests, and the needs. Eventually, with these same teachers, we started teaching, and this won't make much sense to you, but this was a Zoom whiteboard. And we actually, this gratitude practice, we brought it back to relatedness and respecting adults and student behavior. So gratitude actually ended up a way of reframing the whole problem around student behavior. That's what it means to reframe. Okay, so we're going to try some practice here. Part of it is thinking about what something can be. What else can it be? So I'm going to give you a problem, and I want you to write what the problem might be, the underlying problem might be. So what if we say our employees print everything in color, so we spend too much money on ink? What do you think the problem might be here? What do we need to fix? Okay, now you need to come up with another problem. What might another problem be? Okay, so what I think about with this one, if they print everything in color, the problem might be that the printer's broken and it only prints in color. It might be that they actually need everything to be in color, even though management doesn't realize that. It could mean that they don't know how to turn off the color settings and switch over to black and white. It could be that they just don't care. They're not really worried about expenses in the office, so they really don't care about it. So depending on each of these different problems, it's going to change what our solution is. It might be all of the above, but in our needs analysis, we start trying to say what might be a problem and what's something we maybe could address. There's not always a right answer, but it's important to look broadly because a lot of time instructional designers jump directly to, we need to teach them a lesson on this, and that's not always the best solution. All right, here's another one. My students never do their homework. List all the things you can think of. What are the reasons that could be? And then I want you to also write, let's just do 3. What are 3 reasons this might happen? And what are a solution for each of those reasons? So one of my favorite, I had people do this once, and one of my favorite things that people said was their parents didn't know how to do their homework, and so their parents just didn't really encourage the students to do it because the parents didn't want to be embarrassed that they didn't know how to do it. And so at that point, your intervention is, oh, let's do some parent education that's different than just hounding students for homework. Okay, here's another one. This is based off our problem. Teachers use new technologies themselves, so they have cell phones, they use PowerPoint, but they don't let their students use them. Their students don't use any digital technologies in the classroom, even though the teachers already know how. What might be some reasons for that? And what might be some different solutions that could go with those reasons? So overall, the tips to reframing problems: remain tentative and open to change. There's really very rarely a right answer. There's a lot of different ways to approach things. So be open to that. Look at your assumptions. When they say if all you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. If all of your assumptions are we need to teach someone something, then that's all you're going to see. What else can you see? What else can you change? And then look for those overlaps between the needs, what the client's needs, your beliefs, society needs, because those are good areas to focus in on your problem. Okay, so main takeaways this week: we have task analysis, where we explore content with experts to break it down for novices. And then when we problem frame, asking what else might it be, and use that to frame our problem that we're designing for. Thanks for watching.